There is a widespread belief that a lot of our miseries are a direct result of thinking. Pretty much every mental health issue you can think of, or even health issues that stem from things like stress and depression, have their root in thinking. Since those challenges are caused by our thinking, it can be easy to jump to the conclusion that thinking is the root of the problem, and that thinking is generally not good for you. However, that could not be further from the truth. The French moralist Joseph Joubert has an interesting quote about this. He says that misery is almost always the result of thinking. That statement sums up an unfortunate fact of life well, but it needs to be qualified because it isn't quite obvious and can even be misleading. So here is my revised version. Misery is almost always the result of overthinking. Here's why. Thinking itself is actually a good thing. In fact, it is an essential part of life. So thinking itself is not at fault. It's overthinking of faulty thoughts that cause misery, not thinking in and of itself. Psychology actually recognizes the dangers this tendency of overthinking poses to us. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, there is even a term for overthinking. It's called rumination. Wikipedia has a great definition for that term. It sums it up really well. Here it is. Overthinking or rumination is the focused attention on the symptoms of one's distress and on its possible causes and consequences as opposed to its solutions. I'll repeat that for you. It is the focused attention on the symptoms of one's distress. Focused attention on the symptoms of your distress and on its possible causes and consequences as opposed to the solutions. Don't worry if that doesn't quite clarify things, as we will get into more details on that in a bit. But before we dig deeper into why overthinking is bad for you and why active thinking is a much better mode of thinking, let's first clarify what those two look like. That way it will be easier for you to distinguish between the two and watch out for the harmful one. So what does overthinking look like? Generally, here's what happens when you overthink. Your head gets full of one thought, or several thoughts, usually related ones. Those thoughts then fill your head and just go on a loop. The thoughts that fill your head usually tend to be of the dark kind rather than the bright and happy kind. We rarely ever, if ever, overthink positive things, right? So your head gets full of a dark or even an upsetting thought when you're overthinking, and it keeps going on and on in a never-ending loop. If you have ever experienced that, you have experienced overthinking, and I have a feeling you have. Don't feel bad though, because this happens to the best of us. It's a very normal thing. However, understanding and becoming aware of it is the first step towards correcting this unhelpful thinking pattern. Now let's explore what active critical thinking looks like. So this is the counterpart of overthinking. This is the better version. So when you're thinking actively, you're thinking things through. You're working things out and figuring out solutions. Active thinking is all about moving forward and involves you weighing up your options, coming up with ideas to try and so on. Unlike overthinking, with active thinking there is no negative thinking loop. And your line of thinking does not weigh you down or make you feel bad. Active thinking is progressive, while overthinking is regressive. One helps you move forward, while the other generally tends to hold you back. One helps, while the other usually harms. The biggest and probably the easiest way to distinguish between the two patterns of thinking is probably this. Active thinking is solution-focused, while overthinking is problem-focused. After all, if or when you are overthinking things, you get stuck in a veritable jambalaya of negative scenarios that has already happened or can happen. Overthinking is pretty much always focused on doom and gloom scenarios. But active thinking, on the other hand, is all focused on figuring things out and getting through situations, no matter how challenging. Active thinking doesn't deny or hide from challenges, but it does not dwell on them either. Instead, when we think actively, we focus on finding the upsides and the solutions. As should be obvious to you, overthinking is clearly not good for you. But active thinking, on the other hand, can be extremely helpful. Having this clarity will help you to pull yourself out of any overthinking trap you might fall into, since awareness is the first and even the most important step in getting a handle on something that you can and need to deal with. So with that out of the way, let's dig deeper into the disadvantages of overthinking. It is pretty obvious that overthinking isn't a good thing, but having that general idea often isn't enough. The more evidence you can stack against something that isn't good for you, the easier it gets to overcome and uproot that thing from your life. So let's have a look at some of the main drawbacks of overthinking. I'll give you five big ones. So here's the first one. It intensifies negative emotions. When you keep thinking about a negative scenario, you keep feeling worse, and over time this feeling can get stronger the longer you mull over it. So the more you overthink things, usually the worse you feel. The second disadvantage is that it can make you sad. The subject matter of overthinking is nearly always something upsetting, stressful, or negative, and having a loop of such thoughts repeating themselves in your head will hardly ever make you happy. So overthinking often ends up bringing you down. The third one to watch out for is that it can cause a lot of stress and anxiety. This is probably one of the worst side effects or negative impacts of overthinking. Just like how overthinking can make you feel sad, it can also add on to any stress you might feel about something. And the more you think about it, the more stressed you get. This is one of the biggest dangers of overthinking, since stress impacts your overall health and well-being negatively. Stress is called the biggest killer by doctors for good reason, after all. The fourth danger is that it can damage your ability to think clearly. If overthinking is allowed to continue for a while, it can significantly damage your ability to think clearly. And that is the worst possible thing that you can do to yourself when faced with a challenging situation. The reality is that not being able to think clearly or not being able to think things through is only going to make things worse for you, not better. And you know this. The fifth danger is that it can make things worse. As I mentioned earlier, overthinking intensifies any negative feelings you have, can add to your stress, and even negatively impact your ability to think clearly. But it doesn't stop there, because sometimes this tendency to overthink things can become so common and compulsive that it becomes an addiction of sorts. All these can add up to one very dangerous outcome, which is that it can make things worse. If you get really stuck in a loop of overthinking, it can be very hard to find your way out of challenging situations. This actually makes overthinking not just harmful for you, but even makes it dangerous. Not just harmful, but dangerous. This is what can lead people to fall into pits of despair, and that's never a good place to be in. Clearly, overthinking is something that you need to avoid at all costs. Thinking is actually a great thing. Without thinking, we probably would be no different from a table or a chair. The capacity for overthinking is like a superpower that the whole human species has. And even though most of us take it for granted and think nothing of it, this superpower has enabled us to rise to the top of the food chain, despite not being the strongest or the fastest in the animal kingdom. This superpower has enabled us to come a long way since our Neanderthal ancestors, and it won't be an overstatement to say that it has helped us survive and even thrive as a species. However, thinking is like any tool. When it is used well, it helps us, like any tool. But when it is used ineffectively, it can do us harm, like any tool. Overthinking fits the category of using our thinking superpower in a bad way. Most of us are guilty of this, and some more than others. The good news, though, is that overthinking does not have to become a normal part of your life. It doesn't. You can actively make a change in your life so that overthinking becomes less and less of an issue. Understanding what it is, what it looks like, and why it is bad for you will go a long way in helping you overcome this negative and harmful tendency. Even though overthinking might feel like a normal part of life, it actually is not. There is actually nothing normal about overthinking. We are not born with this behavioral trait. Rather, we pick it up later on as we grow older. Just look at a kid, for instance. I doubt you will ever find a kid who overthinks things. Kids don't do that. They don't overthink things because overthinking is not a natural part of our programming. We are not born with the tendency to overthink things. Rather, we pick it up as we grow older. Like many of the other negative and unhelpful behavioral traits that we pick up over the years. That said, in the same way that we learn this negative habit, we can also learn how to stop doing it. It might not be easy, but it absolutely can be done. And since you now know what to look out for, you are in a good place to stop yourself from falling into the trap of overthinking. You also know why overthinking is bad for you, and those reasons will provide additional incentives for your mind to override this negative tendency. Start today. Keep an eye out for if or when you fall into this trap of overthinking. Being vigilant is important. It might slip past your defenses initially, overthinking, but the more you actively look out for overthinking, the easier it will get for you to notice it right at the start of it. And the easier it will get for you to stop yourself from doing it. Awareness is key. Remember, thinking inherently is a good thing. Thinking is actually a very good thing. It has helped us tremendously. Our ability to think has incredible potential and can significantly help improve our lives. But this ability to think is only as good as the way you use it. It is only good as long as it is used to benefit you and as long as you use it well. That is why active thinking is good for you, but overthinking things is not. Use wisely the superpower that is your ability to think. Choose active thinking over overthinking.